And that's partly because higher education really has been catalytic as a field across the country in terms of really holding high the need for institutions of higher education to be locally engaged and identifying as anchor institutions and really seeing that as an opportunity. And so we have all different types of institutions of higher education under this umbrella. Public universities, private universities, community colleges, urban, rural, small, big, they're all within the task force. And our framing is broad enough to continue to bring in hospitals, libraries, museums, community foundations, other types of anchors as well. So we really have a very all-encompassing vision for where the task force can ultimately go. So that's a lot of our thinking about this. And we actually have an annual conference every year, and our annual conference is on December 10th this year, and it will be held at Johns Hopkins University. And I mentioned before the task force is a values-driven entity. And so these are the values of the Anchor Institutions Task Force: collaboration and partnership, equity and social justice, democracy and democratic practice, commitment to place and community. So for us, going back to the very beginning, it's not good enough to just be objectively anchored in a community. That what we are encouraging is that you should be more engaged, but not only more engaged, but there's a way to engage. And a part of the way to engage is to think about these kinds of factors. So the people who join the task force believe in these particular values, and these are the values that we're promoting as we think about anchor institutions. So you can go to the next one. And my last couple slides are just really on sort of the next frontier. Where is this field going? What are some interesting developments? What are some evolving conversations? Things of that sort. And again, going back to this notion of being comprehensive as you think about an anchor institution. Colleges and universities and other anchor institutions are complex organizations. They have multiple parts within them. So it's very hard to get sort of one mind on why it's important to engage in your local community. So that's hard work to do. But there's a lot that we can do to coordinate the various activities that go on in institutions. So how do we tap the full range of resources at a given anchor institution? How do we get beyond singular programs when we think about anchor institutions? So a particular class, a particular grant project, all of those have their own value. But if we're really thinking about leveraging anchor institutions in a way that can transform communities, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that respect, and we need some more coordinated resources and activities. And building internal will throughout institutions, I think, is so essential, because even to this day, as surely there's more conversation about anchor institutions, but the reality is everyone is not necessarily going to see this as a priority in the institution. Everyone is not necessarily going to see local engagement as the business of their institution or as something that actually exhibits their core mission as an institution, or see it as scholarly, or see it as anything that is related to why students are at colleges and universities. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to sort of make the case internally. And as you heard throughout this presentation, I believe the case can be made internally and see lots of opportunities. And so how do you engage in that kind of conversation? Because there are real opportunities there. Systemically enhancing capacity to create and sustain effective local engagement. And going back to, how do you do it in a sustained way? And how do you do it effectively? What are the institutional mechanisms that have to be in place? Now, faculty aren't going to go out and spend hours and days in communities if they don't see that there's an opportunity to actually enhance their scholarly portfolio. And so how do we think about integrating into review, into tenure and promotion, the more applied forms of activity in local communities in terms of scholarship? So how do you sort of redefine scholarship in a way that actually makes sense to this model of anchor institutions being engaged? How do you develop processes that enable shared decisions? So in all of these kinds of partnerships, what are the appropriate processes if we are going to be democratic in partnerships, if we are wanting to make sure that resident voices are at the table alongside anchor institution voices? How do you figure out some way to create shared decision making, and what are the mechanisms to do that? I think that's an important area as you sort of look into the future and where things are going. Ensuring activities achieve tangible results and building the systems to adequately measure progress. I mentioned that before around evaluation. I mean, it's wonderful to do projects that are beneficial primarily to students and faculty, but if we're going to actually make some change and in a lot of ways take advantage of the opportunities that were mentioned in this discussion, we've got to figure out ways to evaluate and to really think about what kind of impact on the community side of the equation do we want, and also what kind of impact do we want on the scholarly side and on the teaching side of it too. So how do we really be clear? How can we be as clear as possible about what are appropriate outcomes for this kind of work for all parties who are involved? And then if we understand appropriate outcomes, how do we actually measure that? What are the best mechanisms to do that? So that's something to think about as well. And of course, securing greater internal and external resources to support anchor engagement. Now, this kind of work, it creates its own expenses. And so we really have to be strategic about figuring out what are the best ways to garner resources for it. And I think that when we look from an opportunistic perspective, you can go to the next slide, but when we look from an opportunistic perspective, there are ways for this kind of work to actually generate new opportunities, generate revenue, generate exposure. So that's a strategic question I think Neil really needs to get figured out. And also in the next frontier, how do we get the full range of people who have a stake in local communities collaborating with each other? Multi-institutional and cross-sector partnerships. And that seems to be an emerging trend in a lot of different parts of the country. Many colleges and universities which were focused on their own programs as an institution maybe 10 or 20 years ago are now talking more about how they are connecting and working with other anchor institutions in their locality, working with local government and the like. Now, these are almost like new forms of governance. They have many features and many factors at work. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand what it takes to make effective cross-sector partnerships. And so the most recent book that I wrote is actually on this topic, strategic public-private partnerships. And how do you really maintain ongoing partnerships? And we talked about this a little bit earlier today. What's the right mechanism for it? Do you create a new organization if you've got multiple different entities and you want to keep a partnership going? What do you do? Do you house the activity inside one of the anchor institutions? There are lots of different questions that need to get figured out here, and that's another area where there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of connecting the various efforts that are going on across the country. I mean, there is a lot of conversation about anchor institutions, and see, on the national level, just like you'll find inside of an institution, you've got many players who are having the same conversation but not necessarily coordinating with each other. And that's one of the things we really wanted to do with the Anchor Institutions Task Force, is to create an entity that really anyone could join. Anyone who really believes in these particular ideas and this particular role for anchor institutions can come to the table. So by doing that, we could really get across all the different organizations that are having this conversation and bring it into one discussion. So I think that's another important one. And then there's nothing left to be said except thank you. But I appreciate your time and your patience in listening to me talk about this issue, which I believe is absolutely essential and critical. And hopefully, as you think through your own strategies as an institution and think through how you collaborate inside of this entity, there were some kernels of wisdom that could be instructive to you as you go forward. But thanks again for your time. Those of you who have been to some previous conversations know we do want to take a minute
take a deep breath and take the pulse of the room with what you heard. And so I would ask, first of all, if you're leaving, do sign the sign-in sheet. But before you do, if you can take just 5 minutes with your table, and I think we have a scribe or facilitator at each table, and just very briefly, your top-of-mind reaction to what you heard.
I just took that generally that place matters. And I think as Cleveland State has, and the Euclid Corridor Project has kind of really changed the dynamics just in the last 7-8 years, Cleveland State becomes a more desirable place to go to, not only just go to school and kind of commute in, but to live here. So
we're currently invested in building a residential neighborhood. To what extent are we using community resources to help make this happen, rather than simply building community resources? And is this going to be integrated locally, or are we trying to insulate ourselves?
They're going to be like the foundation of that. So if you have better education and all that, it's going to lead to a better Anchor institution.
So, and with you saying that, talking about the access or the college access, you're saying that maybe the institutions themselves, the higher ed ones, should have, I guess, in place more comprehensive programming, so to speak, resources, right, for students to help them.
How can that transition be made?
Finding a balance.
Finding a balance in which jobs for profit are also included in the equation.
So we're building housing and that kind of thing. But the problem there is it's not affordable. So who lives in that space, and who have we displaced to build that space? So as we think about it, I don't know that we want to do competing activities in the name of civic engagement.
Definitely collaborative. We're not seen as sort of the enemy or the outside force. It's not
That we become neighbors.
right.
what I think is also a challenge too is what happens when these organizations that can and want to be anchor institutions, they need just as much as maybe the community needs. So, how do you form, how can other anchor institutions come in and make sure everything's mutually beneficial? Because sometimes I think that's the challenge too, is how are you sure everybody's
To find that balance.
right? And that goes back to place too, because schools just by place are often, or used to be, I guess. It's interesting because I think that's changing too. As schools are closed or things move around, that notion of place changes.
You can come to this facility and use this computer because you are a resident and we are neighbors, and you don't have to have an account at their bank to do it. It's a neighborhood community facility, so they become an anchor and a partner there.
We are trying to evaluate, that's why I brought that issue, to evaluate how the investment in the community helps the university, because we are asking the student at the end of the year how many have been offered a job on their field placement. So, for example, this year at least we have 7 students who have been hired. See, at the in the organization where they are working. So that is
That's good feedback.
yes, because
And it shows success.
yes.
All right, let's. How about just a quick one thing from each table that you came up with, or that was shared?
CSU alone can't do it. Has to partner, the university or any anchor institution has to partner with other anchor institutions in order to be successful at this complicated work.
Great, good. So that's a good point that came out. I'm sure others had that. How about another table? What did you all get, Lee? Where?
One of the things that resonated strongly was the idea of skill refinement within CSU or the institution, students within the institution, and how it contributes to community growth.
Okay, good.
And we did see several challenges which we can continue talking about for a long time.
Okay.
One of the first things that was raised was the Boston University example, how they have this record enrollment, and we wondered if Cleveland State would be getting 50,000 applicants.
There you go.
But the point of the place mattering, and that Cleveland State becomes more desirable as the development on Euclid Avenue happens, and the development of East 4th Street, and the Student Center now. We were talking about going on college visits with some of our own children and seeing, the rec center is much better than it was before, so the place matters.